Information in this podcast is of general nature only. It does not take into account your personal needs or objectives. Before investing in any product, you need to consider your personal situation, needs and objectives. Always seek professional advice for your particular circumstances and needs prior to investing.
Right.
Well, Lauren, good morning again.
Good morning, Dave. How are you?
I'm well, and special guest, Susanna Ratcliffe, joining us from Disability Housing Solutions. Susanna is an expert in all things SDA and has, well, I won't steal your thunder, Suze. Why don't you give us a brief intro to yourself?
Yeah, look, my background is in direct support. So I've been in disability for 20 years now, believe it or not, with this fresh face. So I started out in support work, really dealing with the nuts and bolts on the ground. And then for the better part of, 15 years was in management and direct support provision. So managing SILs, setting up SILs, looking at the profitability and the models there to make it viable for providers to provide that supported independent living for people with a disability.
Really, you touched on something. Great intro, thank you. And there's so much in there that we can unpack. So we're going to spend the next 20 minutes or so. Really, this episode we wanted to talk about what's it like in this ecosystem of specialist disability accommodation for SIL providers. There's such an important part of the puzzle, and it can be a bit of a puzzle. And with your background, I don't know anyone personally more qualified to sort of who's walked in both sides of this of this lane, right? So I suppose if you wouldn't mind, could you start by sort of giving your assessment or your sort of observations about how do SDA providers and SIL providers interact in the
Yeah, look, it's separating the bricks and mortar from the person-to-person support. So your SIL provider is there every day on the ground in the home, making sure that that person who's living there is getting the support that they need to live safely and independently. Your SDA provider is dealing with the environment, so making sure that that environment remains a safe place and a sustainable home for them to live in to remain living independently. So when they work together, it's making sure that the environment is doing what it needs to do in order for the supports to be provided in the way that's needed. And that's how those interactions happen.
Yeah, that's a good explanation.
Sorry, Loz, you go.
No, I was just going to say it's a nice, simple explanation. I think it's something that investors sometimes don't foresee. It's a complex relationship, but pretty much anyone in an SDA is going to be receiving supports either informally from family or via a support company such as a SIL provider. And so recognising that difference between the two is very important. And it does make a really big difference in, the whole industry in terms of separating out that support, which is almost the reason why we're having this conversation, is to just touch on, okay, how do you separate out support versus housing and why is that important? So yeah, no, that's a good insight, Suze.
And yeah, because they're very distinct things, right? So there's the support to the participant and then the living environment that they're in. And they're certainly related, but they're distinct. And and there's a lot of SIL providers just do that. And then some SIL providers also manage their own SDA homes. And they kind of walk both sides. So have you seen a lot of that?
Look, I think it's becoming less and less common because there are complexities in providing both of those services, although there are still providers out there who are choosing to do both. Yeah.
What extra challenges does that throw up for a SIL provider?
Look, I think really there's a lot of talk at the moment about conflict of interest. So there's things like if the support model is no longer viable for somebody, the support provider is holding a lease and they're then having to, give them notices to leave and things like that. If the tenant's not getting the support that they want, or there's not a good match between the provider and the tenant, they can't just change providers. They need to actually change their home. Which is difficult because SDA, in essence, is supposed to be providing a long-term housing option for those tenants. So that definitely is a challenge. There's administrative challenges as well, in situations where the SIL provider holds the lease and the tenants are bound to them. Often those SIL providers are doing things like setting up the internet in their company name. They're managing all of the food, the budgeting, all of that sort of thing. And that's extra administrative work for a SIL provider. That brings changes in itself.
Yeah,
and
because
so we've talked. Sorry, Dave. I love discussing this with Susan. It's something that we've talked about year on year, and we've always had a really firm, I suppose, goal within SDA is that the SDA properties there really are providing a better opportunity for people with a disability that need that specialised environment to actually feel like they're part of the community and they are a regular tenant, as you or I might be, so they are responsible for their own internet. They are responsible for paying their electricity bill and choosing their own provider and really gaining those skills to, operate as a regular member of society. Whereas when a SIL provider does do all of that management and administration and set up for them, quite often they won't know who to call if the internet goes kaput one day. And they don't know, how much they're paying in electricity, and they don't have that opportunity to build those skills to be more independent. And so by separating out those supports versus housing, the housing provider doesn't go and do all of those things for them, but gives them the opportunity to arrange it themselves and to, find different providers and get a better deal and trial out different services themselves. So it's something, Suze, you've always been really passionate about. And I remember talking about this in one of the first SCAs we did together, in that a SIL provider was used to doing that for a participant, but we really fought for them to be able to do that independently with the support of their network if they needed it. But it's something that I think is important to keep in the back of our minds all the time is, what administration is a company doing for a person that they could actually do themselves?
really
Absolutely.
great.
The whole point of supported independent living, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're helping people and supporting them to be as independent as possible. And that's the role of the support workers, providing that SIL support.
Yes.
And I can imagine for a SIL provider with a limited scope within the supports they're being paid for, to take on all that extra kind of administration, it's, just looking from a business perspective, it's a cost overhead they might not be remunerated for. So the margins get smaller and smaller and smaller for a SIL if they're handling all that extra stuff for the participant, which in an ideal world would empower that person to handle themselves.
That's right.
And I think what you're both talking about, if we had to give it a name, it's just called property management. Right?
Yeah.
Just like we've all rented houses at some point, everyone. And the Ray White or LJ Hooker never hooked up my internet for me.
No.
Or handled my power bill or whatever. It's always on me.
And it's a big learning curve. Do you remember we would have all been, I don't know, somewhere, I'm assuming between 18 and 24, depending. I think that age is getting slightly older as we go. Rent is increasing, but the first time you set up your electricity bill, it's an absolute minefield to figure out, a painful lesson to learn, but the sense of achievement and the sense of independence you get when you get that sorted and you pay your own bills and you work out your budget, it's capacity building for all of us. And it's something that I think, in the old sort of block style funding of pre-NDIS, it was all sort of taken care of within those block budgets. But now it is something that people can really have a lot more control over themselves, which is important. And that definitely comes with the division of support and accommodation.
Well, something we're exploring at Disability Housing Solutions is we're very aware that there's some SIL providers out there who own or manage or they in some way control SDA properties. And to untangle that is extraordinarily challenging for the SIL, and it could be financially detrimental. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that home may never leave that SIL provider. But what we're exploring is an opportunity to hand off this part we're calling property management, because there's two parts to this, right? There's been an SDA provider and there's property management. At Disability Housing Solutions, we do both. We wrap it all up. But we're working with some SIL providers where they'll remain as an SDA provider, and they can carve out the property management services, and it does create an element then of separation, and you can leave it to us then to have those capacity building conversations and empower the tenant to take control of their life in their power, their groceries, their food, all of the rest of it that we'd like to see people grow capacity in. I think that's, if you're listening to this and you're a SIL provider in that situation, I mean, reach out to another SDA provider. But there's something you could explore, that there's a big push at NDIA level, and it's been going on for a few years. It's going to continue to happen, about separation and choice of control. And I should caveat all this. For a lot of participants, it really works for them to have their SIL provider handle all this stuff. It really works for them. So the separation doesn't work for everybody, but it might work for others. And if that's the situation you're in, maybe carve out your property management services to someone else, someone accredited, an NDIS registered accredited SDA provider. How do you think that would work, Suze, if that was like an offer for some people?
Absolutely. I think that there's merit in that, and I think it's advantageous for a SIL provider. There's the opportunity there to have an additional level of safeguarding that doesn't just sit on the SIL provider as well. So you're looking at things like your disaster management plans. So it means when an event happens, it's not just the SIL provider who needs to jump in and make sure, the safety of that tenant is managed. There's an SDA provider or a property manager there who understands the environment and what needs to happen in the event of an emergency as well.
And we've seen in a couple of examples already where a SIL provider might own a property, and so they'll maintain ownership of the property as the landlord, but separate out that property management component to an accredited SDA provider, and then they can just focus on the supports, and it gives them that level of, like you said, Suze, oversight and assistance in managing anything that happens in relation to the property. So all of the, Dave, you mentioned it's sort of been coming from the top down for a couple of years, and when the SDA legislation was released, it was in a bit of a grey sense. It was suggested that accommodation and supports should be separated, and we did expect that to be a slow separation because previous to the NDIS, the SIL providers owned the accommodation. And so, we needed that private investment market to come to town and to build SDAs, and then SDA providers actually take that head lease and start the provision of accommodation with SIL providers coming in. We still have all of that historic stock that's got people in it that slowly needs to separate out from all SIL provider managed to, supports managed by that SIL provider, and possibly they're also the owner of the property, and then the accommodation being managed by an SDA provider. So it's not only in that original legislation, but it's now also been recommended in the review recommendations that were released recently. So they really are starting to push that as an agenda item, and definitely some sort of creativity in how that can really serve as a win-win for tenants, SIL providers and SDA providers, so that to make sure that we're getting the best outcome for our tenants.
Yeah, that's the important part. It's got to work for everybody. It's got to be a win-win-win, right? There's a lot of stakeholders here, and there's a lot of people to sort of get it right with. This is a full-on episode today, isn't it? There's a lot of content, and it's big and in it. I guess lastly, again, we don't want these to go for too long, right? So, look, if you're an SDA provider and you've got participants that are looking for, if you're a SIL provider and you've got participants or clients looking for an SDA home, what are the sort of things, Suze, that SIL providers are looking for in a home for their people?
Look, really, they're looking at the needs of the tenant going in. They're looking at those SDA design features and how that's going to meet the needs of the tenant. And I think when they're looking at an SDA provider, they're looking at someone who's going to work with them, to make sure that there's longevity in that relationship and in that tenancy, so that, there's stability. Yeah.
Okay. So the longevity, stability, credibility of an SDA provider for that home as well. So there's a lot there. What do you think? That's probably enough for this episode, do you think? Is there any more final points?
If I can just raise one last little thing for, say SIL providers to think about, is that, your SDA provider there is to be an independent and supportive mediator. So when there are concerns from either the tenant or the support provider about the tenancy, you've got a third party there who is, you know, obviously there to help support the tenancy long term. But it is a really nice sort of triangle of communication. You know, you've got your SDA provider there that is really trying to support everybody within that environment. And I've seen some really, really great outcomes of SDA providers and SIL providers working together to overcome some issues with tenants and vice versa. And when there is that third party there as an independent and sort of unbiased provider, it's a nice balance and it's a nice addition to the conversation. Sometimes it's not just like, oh, I don't like that provider anymore, we're out. You know, there's a person there to help try and I don't know, assist with that conversation and provide support for it rather than it just being really often a difficult conversation. So that to me has been one of the biggest benefits that we see, and something that Susanna in particular has been involved in quite a few of those conversations and really worked through what the core issues are, how together as a group of stakeholders we can work to fix that and support the tenant better, and end up with a really great long-term housing solution with the right supports. So it's usually a really good outcome with that combination.
Wonderful. Susanna, anything from you? Final point?
No, look, I think Lauren just hit the nail on the head, to be honest. You know, it's a collaboration that works really well, you know, and everyone sees a benefit from it when you've got that collaboration in place.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you. We'll tie it off and we'll probably see each other again, I think, really soon.
Okay.
Look to it.
Thanks, Sue.
See ya.